After my grandfather left me everything, the parents who abandoned me as a baby dragged me into court as if I owed them the life they never gave me. The morning I walked into that courtroom, the air felt colder than the winters I grew up surviving alone. My mother rolled her eyes the second she saw me, a gesture so small yet sharp enough to reopen every wound she'd ever left on me. But the moment that silenced the room was when the judge looked up, saw my face, and froze. It wasn't shock. It was recognition. As if my grandfather had walked back into the courtroom through me, and in that instant I knew this trial wasn't just about inheritance. It was about truth. And who stayed, and who walked away. My name is Jacob Rourke, and this is the story I've held inside my entire life. Before I share it with you, I'd love to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if my voice or my journey resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, especially for someone who grew up feeling like no one was listening. Pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Denver County Court that morning, it felt like walking straight into the coldest winter of my life. The kind of cold that doesn't touch your skin first, it goes straight to your bones. I'm Jacob Rourke, 30 years old, a financial crimes prosecutor who has spent a decade dissecting lies for a living. But nothing prepared me for the moment I became the defendant in a lawsuit filed by the two people who abandoned me before I could even form a memory of them. My footsteps echoed through the packed courtroom, each one swallowed by murmurs, camera shutters, the shifting energy of people eager to witness a family tearing itself apart. And then I saw her, my mother Marilyn Graves, sitting with perfect posture and perfect makeup, looking like she was attending a luncheon rather than suing her own son. The second her eyes landed on me, she rolled them sharp, dismissive, the kind of gesture people reserve for strangers who inconvenience them. My father, Dexter Graves, couldn't look at me. He fiddled with his tie, pulling at the knot like he wanted to choke himself or disappear, maybe both. That was the first time I had seen either of them in years. The last time before that, I didn't even know how to speak yet. I describe it now, but in that moment the only thing I felt was the old, familiar emptiness of not being wanted. The weight of it settled over me again as I took my seat beside my attorney. But the room didn't truly shift until Judge Rowan Hale looked up. His gaze seemed to snag on mine mid-sentence, his voice faltering as if someone had pressed pause on him. He froze just for a second, but long enough that even the court reporter glanced up. I knew exactly what he was seeing. Not me. Not Jacob. He was seeing the ghost of the man who raised me. Alistair Rourke, his mentor, his guide, the judge who shaped his entire judicial philosophy, reborn in my face, my posture, maybe even the way I breathed. Recognition flooded his expression with something like shock and something like grief. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was an echo chamber of unresolved history. And as I sat there feeling every eye on me, one question cut through the noise. Why did my presence stop the judge cold? And what did that mean for the battle about to unfold? To understand why the judge froze and why this trial cut deeper than any case I've ever prosecuted, I have to go back to the beginning, back to a winter night in Aspen when I was 3 months old. I've been told the snow was thick enough to bury fence posts and that the wind screamed through the pines like something alive. That was the night Marilyn left me on my grandparents' porch, wrapped in a thin blanket that wasn't enough for mountain cold. The story goes that my grandfather, Judge Alistair Rourke, opened the door after hearing a faint sound, somewhere between a cry and a choke. He found me half blue from the cold, my tiny hands trembling against a slip of paper that read in rushed handwriting, "I can't do this. Please take him." My grandmother Odette rushed me to the fire, holding me against her chest as though love alone could thaw a child. They had no son of their own, only Marilyn, the same Marilyn now sitting in court acting like I was the one who failed her. I grew up in that cabin in Aspen, surrounded by the small rituals that became the architecture of my childhood. The low hum of my grandfather's radio at exactly 7 p.m. always tuned to the same station. The smell of my grandmother's elk stew filling the house every Sunday. The garden of lupines stretching behind the cabin, tall purple spires swaying like they belonged to another world entirely. That was where I learned steadiness, discipline, how to build something with my own hands. In the evenings, my grandfather spread case files across the kitchen table and taught me how to think, how to read people, how truth works when you strip away excuses. Those were the moments that shaped me. But they didn't erase the emptiness. No matter how much love my grandparents gave me, there were days I watched other kids climb into their parents' cars after school and wondered what it was like to have a hand reach back for you to be chosen without conditions. For years I believed Marilyn and Dexter simply disappeared. But as I grew older, I learned the truth: they didn't disappear. They just never showed up. Not for a birthday, not for a holiday, not for one single school event. My grandfather tried to reach them more times than I can count. They never answered. I spent most of my life thinking that was the whole story. Then, after my grandmother passed, I found her journal tucked behind a row of recipe books. That's when the ground shifted under me. 3 entries spread across years detailed Marilyn's quiet visits to Aspen. Not to see me, not once. She came to ask for money. Each time, my grandmother tried to guide the conversation toward me, how I was doing, whether Marilyn wanted to talk to me, whether she wanted to see me, but the journal was painfully clear. Marilyn never asked. Not once did she write my name. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with that journal open, the ink faded, but the truth sharp as glass. Had my grandmother planned to tell me? Or was she trying to protect me from a mother who came back only when she needed something? She never got the chance to explain. She died before I could ask her. And now here I was, back in a courtroom facing the same woman who had walked away from me 3 times without even looking at the child she left behind. A year before the trial, my life had still felt anchored, even with the quiet ache of grief lingering from losing my grandmother 2 years earlier. But nothing prepares you for the moment the last person who ever chose you takes his final breath. I was in the living room with my grandfather when it happened. He was reading the paper glasses sliding down his nose the way they always did when he concentrated. One moment he was turning a page. The next he pressed a hand to his chest and exhaled a sound I had never heard from him. Thin, strained, almost surprised. I caught him before he collapsed, fully lowering him to the rug. His hand found my wrist, gripping with the last of his strength as he whispered, "Stand tall, Jacob. Truth survives everything." Those were his final words. They branded themselves into me in a way nothing else ever had. His funeral in Aspen was modest, but overflowing with people whose lives he had shaped. Judges, clerks, old friends from his hiking group, neighbors who'd known him since before I was born, they all came. They shared stories about him, the kind that made me feel the loss twice over. But near the edge of the gathering, apart from everyone else, stood 2 people who didn't belong there yet carried my blood, Marilyn and Dexter. My mother and father, at least by biology. They didn't shed a tear. They didn't bow their heads. They didn't even look at the casket. Instead, Marilyn watched the crowd the way a performer studies an audience. Dexter pretended to wipe his eyes whenever someone glanced his way. When the service ended, I tried to slip away, but they intercepted me before I reached my car. Marilyn forced a smile as if we were reuniting after a minor misunderstanding instead of 3 decades of silence. "Jacob," she said, placing a hand over her heart. "It's your mother." Dexter chimed in. "And your father. We've missed you." Hearing them say those words made something inside me twist, not with longing but with resentment so old it felt fossilized. I told them I had nothing to say and started to walk, but they followed me into the parking lot, insisting they wanted to repair our family, that we could start over, that blood still mattered. I left without answering because nothing they said made sense in the context of the life they'd chosen to ignore. A week later, the call came from my grandfather's lawyer. I sat in the conference room as he read the will, my name appearing again and again. The house in Aspen, the land, the bank accounts, the rare book collection he'd curated for decades, the $3.4 million he'd saved across a lifetime of discipline and restraint. Everything was left to me. Not because I asked, not because I expected it, but because I was the one who stayed when everyone else left. I didn't have time to process the weight of it. Not even 48 hours after the will was read, Marilyn and Dexter filed a lawsuit accusing me of manipulating a mentally compromised elderly man for financial gain. They painted me as a predator, a liar, someone who isolated him from his true family. Their words were venomous, but none of that compared to what came next. Attached to the complaint was an audio recording, supposedly my grandfather's voice, saying he feared I was forcing him to sign papers he didn't understand. The second I heard it, my stomach dropped. It wasn't him. The cadence was wrong. The breath patterns were wrong. The softness on the vowels missing. But it was close enough that someone who didn't know him could be convinced. Whoever made that recording had spent time with him. Whoever helped them had been in his orbit long enough to mimic him. And that realization opened a door to a much darker question: how far were Marilyn and Dexter willing to go, and who else had they pulled into this? By the time the first day of trial arrived, the Rourke estate case had become a spectacle. Denver County Court felt more like the site of a political scandal than a probate dispute. I walked past lines of reporters flashing cameras and strangers whispering theories like they were discussing a TV drama instead of my life. The gallery was full colleagues from the DA's office, Aspen locals who had known my grandparents' law students, hoping to witness something extraordinary. I took my seat beside Harper Wynn, the attorney who had known my grandfather long enough to treat this case as personally as I did. The opposing counsel, a polished man with a rehearsed frown and a voice trained to sound sincere, launched immediately into a narrative designed to shred everything I knew to be true. He claimed I had isolated my grandfather, controlled access to him, manipulated him emotionally and mentally in his final years. He painted Alistair Rourke as a fragile old man stripped of his agency, and me as the one who stripped it. Hearing him rewrite my grandfather's life felt like being slapped in slow motion. This was not the man who hiked mountains at 70. This was not the man who debated legal philosophy 2 nights before his death. But the lies were crafted well enough to make anyone who hadn't known him wonder. Harper rose calm as a surgeon and dismantled the argument piece by piece. She introduced medical records showing he had passed cognitive evaluations with exceptional clarity just a week before he died. She reminded the court that my grandfather had presided over cases demanding sharp mental acuity until mere months before his passing. The truth was on our side, but truth wasn't the only player in the room. The opposing side called a surprise witness, a woman they claimed had been our neighbor in Aspen, who insisted I'd turned her away when she tried visiting my grandfather. She spoke as if she had known us for years, but the moment she stepped onto the stand, something felt off. I'd never seen her before in my life. A few minutes into her testimony, the lie started to unravel. Under questioning, she slipped and admitted she'd only ever spoken to my grandfather twice. Harper then produced security footage from the day this witness claimed she was denied entry, footage showing my grandfather and me in Vail, laughing on a ski lift. The woman faltered, stammered, sweating beneath the weight of the evidence. The courtroom buzzed as the false narrative cracked. Just when the room began to tilt our way, Marilyn stood. She held a folded piece of paper, her expression a mix of manufactured sorrow and something sharper underneath. She said it was a letter from my grandfather sent to her before his death, expressing fear that I was influencing him. Hearing his name come from her mouth was enough to make my jaw clench. When the judge allowed her to submit it, I studied the handwriting. At first glance, it resembled his script. But some strokes were wrong, the loops too wide, the pressure inconsistent. I knew that handwriting like I knew my own breath. And this wasn't it. It reminded me more of another hand entirely, Dexter's, whose signature I'd seen shaking on documents at the funeral. As the courtroom murmured, the letter passed from hand to hand, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just desperation. This was orchestration. And for all their bluster about truth and family, the story they were selling was built on borrowed voices and forged ink. I walked out of the courtroom that day knowing one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't only about money. This was about rewriting a legacy, erasing a man's life, and painting me as the villain in a family I never belonged to. And I understood then that clearing my name meant defending his as well. The second week of the trial opened with something I wasn't prepared for: not hostility, not lies, but the unexpected sight of people from my childhood stepping into that courtroom as if summoned by the truth itself. These were the voices of Aspen, the people who'd watched me grow up in the shadow of the Rockies, the people who knew the rhythm of our small cabin, the man who raised me, and the woman who kept our world stitched together. Seeing them in the gallery, lined faces, winter-worn jackets, the kind eyes of people who remembered me before I even remembered myself, sent a wave of emotion tightening across my chest. The first witness Harper called was my grandfather's longtime physical therapist, a steady man with silver hair and steady hands. He spoke plainly with no embellishment, telling the court that Alistair remained fully independent in his decisions until the very end. He listed dates, sessions, conversations, everything detailed and clinical, each fact striking at the heart of Marilyn's claims. According to him, my grandfather showed no signs of confusion, disorientation, or diminished capacity. Instead, he was confident, engaged, and fiercely protective of his autonomy. Then came the sculptor who lived across the meadow from our cabin. She spoke about my grandfather carrying stacks of books to her porch, about how he lit up when he talked about me, how he described me as the only person I trust without hesitation. Her words steadied something inside me. They didn't just defend me, they defended him, restoring the dignity Marilyn's accusations had tried to strip away. But the room truly shifted when Harper called my third-grade teacher. A quiet man with tired eyes, he stood at the witness stand like someone carrying the weight of long-kept truths. He recalled how Marilyn once came to the school not for me not to see how I was doing or even to ask about my progress, but to request documentation proving she was legally my mother. She demanded the records so she could access financial aid meant for low-income children. She never asked about me, never even came down the hallway to look through the classroom window. A collective gasp moved through the courtroom. Even the reporters stopped typing. I watched Marilyn's face stiffen, her jaw tightening as if she could hold the truth in place through sheer force. Dexter pulled at her sleeve, whispering, urging her to sit still. For the first time, the flawless facade they'd brought into court began to splinter. Harper pressed forward, presenting bank statements that traced 22 years of financial support, $845,000 sent from my grandfather to Marilyn, a stark contradiction to her claims of abandonment. She sat, frozen, lips parted, unable to spin a lie quick enough to survive the blow. Then Harper revealed a piece of evidence we'd held in reserve, a security camera clip. The footage played on the large screen Marilyn standing at my grandfather's gate years earlier. She had come. But the moment she learned he wasn't home, she turned around and left without a second thought. No note, no call, no attempt to see me. She had the opportunity she claimed she'd been denied, and she walked away. The weight of that realization wasn't just legal, it was personal. A lifetime of wondering, why wasn't I enough, suddenly had an answer that cut and healed all at once. As murmurs filled the room, Dexter lost his composure. He snapped at Marilyn, grabbing her arm too tightly, hissing at her to get it together. She jerked away from him, her voice rising with fury. "This is your fault," she spat loud enough that the courtroom turned to watch them combust. Their partnership, whatever it had been built on, started collapsing right there in front of me before any verdict had been reached. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the tide begin to turn. The following morning, the tension was palpable. The air in the courtroom felt heavier, as though everyone sensed something significant was coming. And they were right. The plaintiff's side launched their boldest move, yet a new witness, a doctor who claimed to have evaluated my grandfather in his final days. He testified that my grandfather showed signs of confusion, hesitation, even fear. Harper's head snapped up. This witness had never been disclosed, never appeared in any pre-trial materials. It was a breach of procedure, a strategic ambush. The judge allowed limited testimony, but the disruption was real. The plaintiff's attorney paraded the doctor forward as the missing piece of their narrative, the professional validation of their claim. But something about him was wrong. His demeanor, his guarded gaze, it tugged at a memory. And then it clicked. I had seen him before, briefly, at my grandfather's funeral. Not standing with mourners, standing beside Dexter. That connection hit me like a cold gust of aspen wind. This wasn't coincidence. This was arrangement. When Harper requested his medical records, he stuttered before claiming they'd been misfiled or misplaced. The courtroom erupted. A doctor losing crucial records in a high-profile case didn't just look suspicious, it looked orchestrated. Still, without solid proof, we were forced to hold our ground and wait for an opening. That opening arrived from a place I hadn't expected: my grandmother's handwriting. The night before, while searching through the old storage cabinets in the Aspen house, I'd found a second journal belonging to my grandmother, one she kept separate from her daily entries. The pages were fragile, worn from years, but her words were unmistakable. And they told a story the court had not yet heard. The last conversation she ever had with Marilyn. In it, Marilyn demanded that the will be changed so she could receive a portion of the estate. When my grandparents refused, she threatened legal action. She didn't mention me, not once. According to the entry, she only talked about what she believed she deserved. Harper read the passage aloud, her voice steady, her cadence precise. Every word peeled away the lies Marilyn had been building since the first day of trial. Then there was the final entry, a description of a man who came to their door unannounced, asking questions about my grandfather's health and whether the will had been changed. My grandmother noted his build, his face, the slight scar near his ear. I looked across the courtroom. The description matched the new doctor perfectly. Harper seized the moment. She pointed out the connection between the doctor and Dexter, the sudden appearance of this witness, and the matching description in my grandmother's journal. The courtroom exploded with whispers, outrage, and disbelief. Judge Rowan Hale raised his hand for silence, his expression darkening. He ordered an independent inquiry into the doctor's credibility and his relationship with my parents. For a moment, the facade Marilyn and Dexter had clung to fractured completely. Marilyn's hands trembled. Dexter's face flushed with anger. Their narrative, carefully constructed and loudly defended, was beginning to unravel. And as I stood there listening to the echoes of my grandmother's words, I understood something deeper. This fight wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't even about me. It was about protecting the truth of the two people who had chosen me when no one else did. It was about defending their name, their integrity, and the life they built for me. And whoever had helped my parents, whoever had manipulated the shadows of this case, was finally being pulled into the light. The morning of the preliminary ruling felt like trying to breathe through a fist tightening around my chest. The courtroom was already overflowing when I walked in. Reporters pressed shoulder to shoulder, spectators whispering behind raised hands, all of them staring at a family I'd never truly belonged to. Every camera turned when Marilyn entered. She looked flawless, sculpted, almost like someone stepping onto a stage instead of into the consequences of her own choices. Dexter followed behind her, pale and jittery, his hands shaking so visibly that even the bailiff noticed. When the judge called us to order, Harper rose for closing arguments. She centered her entire presentation around the journals, my grandmother's ink, my grandmother's truth. Every page described years of disappointment, years of trying to maintain some connection with their daughter, while protecting me from the damage of her absence. Listening to Harper read those entries aloud felt like reliving every unspoken hurt my grandparents endured. Their pain filled the room in a way Marilyn could not spin or disguise. Then came the moment no one expected. Harper played a new recording, a phone call. Dexter's voice, unmistakable, tense and hurried, speaking to a man whose voice sent a ripple across the courtroom. It was the so-called doctor. Dexter told him plainly to make sure the testimony matches what we need. The murmurs exploded instantly. The judge raised his gavel twice to restore order, but the shock was already tearing through the room. Dexter stood stammering, denying everything, while Marilyn's face drained of color. She tried to distance herself, shaking her head, but her eyes betrayed knowledge. She knew. She had always known. Harper pressed forward. She submitted a sealed letter addressed to Judge Rowan Hale, written by my grandfather 2 months before he died. The judge opened it with a steadiness that made the entire room hold its breath. My grandfather's handwriting flowed across the page, clear and steady. He affirmed his decision to revise the will. He stated explicitly that his mental faculties were intact. And then came the words that silenced every breath in the courtroom. If my daughter returns, it will be for what I have, not for who I am. Protect the truth for Jacob, the only one who stayed. The weight of those words demolished every remaining argument Marilyn had built. Before the judge could speak further, an elderly man stood in the gallery. He raised his hand, trembling. He confessed that he had been approached by Marilyn weeks ago, paid to give false testimony about my grandfather being isolated. He apologized directly to the court, then to me. It was as if the threads holding decades of lies together snapped all at once. I felt something inside me loosen, a flood of relief and grief washing through me as the truth finally broke open. For 30 years, my existence had been shaped by their absence. Now it was their lies collapsing under the weight of evidence. As the session adjourned, I stood and looked at Marilyn, really looked at her. The woman who had walked away from her child now watched everything she'd built unravel. For the first time I saw it clearly, she wasn't losing the case. She was losing the last illusion of the story she'd told herself for decades. The chamber fell silent around us, and I realized the verdict wasn't even necessary for the truth to be known. On the morning of the final judgment, Denver was wrapped in a layer of gray clouds, the kind that reminded me of snowy mornings in Aspen, when my grandmother would place warm tea in my hands until my fingers thawed. I arrived at the courthouse early, standing for a moment under the cold air, letting it settle me. Inside, Judge Rowan Hale began by presenting the results of the independent investigation. The courtroom was motionless, as he read. The doctor was not a treating physician, nor had he ever examined my grandfather. His testimony had been purchased. The audio recording Marilyn submitted had been digitally altered. The timeline of her claims was inconsistent with documented travel records. The truth was no longer a matter of interpretation, it was fact. Then came the final blow. Investigators traced payments made to the fake doctor directly to Dexter. The content used to coach the witness came from Marilyn. Their scheme wasn't just deceitful. It was deliberate, coordinated, and criminal. Harper stepped forward, asking the court to consider charges for fraud and obstruction. Judge Hale didn't answer immediately, but the request went into the official record. For the first time all trial, Marilyn's composure shattered. She slumped back into her chair, hands trembling uncontrollably. Dexter kept his head down, unable to look at me, unable to look at anyone. As Judge Hale read my grandfather's letter aloud, I closed my eyes. Hearing his words in that courtroom, steady, wise, resolute, felt like standing beside him again. I'd spent so long fighting shadows that hearing his voice break through felt like he was returning to carry the truth himself. The judge delivered the ruling. The will was valid. The case was dismissed with prejudice. All legal fees would be paid by Marilyn and Dexter, and the matter of their misconduct would be forwarded to the district attorney's office for review. It was over. Or so I thought. As people filtered out of the courtroom, Marilyn rushed toward me. Her mascara streaked, her voice frayed. She grasped my arm and said, "We can fix this. You owe me that. I gave you life." Her words felt like ice sliding into my chest. I answered calmly, "The people who raise you are your parents. Biology is not love." Then I walked away. I did not look back. Returning to Aspen felt like stepping into a memory. I cleaned my grandparents' cabin, slowly touching each object as if greeting it again. In my grandfather's study, I found a small wooden box labeled, "For When You Win." Inside was a miniature gavel, hand-carved, and a single sentence etched beneath it. "Justice is not an act, but a legacy." A year later, I stood in my chambers as the youngest judge in Colorado, the gavel resting on my shelf. My life had taken a new shape, one built on the values my grandparents gave me, not the wounds my parents left behind. On the first warm day of spring, I returned to Aspen with a bouquet of lupine. I laid them on the graves of Alistair and Odette and whispered, "I didn't just win the case. I won back the part of myself that always belonged to you." As I walked down the hillside, sunlight cutting through the last traces of winter, I understood something I should have known long ago. Family is not determined by the people who create us, but by the people who choose us, stay for us, and love us without condition. When I look back on everything, the cold nights in Aspen, the long hours in the courtroom, the weight of secrets I never asked to carry, I understand something I couldn't see when I was younger. Survival wasn't the victory. Becoming whole was. For years, I carried my abandonment like a shadow stitched to my heels, believing it defined me, shaped me, limited me. I thought being left behind at 3 months old meant I had been born lacking something essential, something other kids deserved automatically. But the truth is, my grandparents had been rewriting that story for me from the moment they opened the front door and found me in a blanket of snow. I didn't realize it then. Children rarely do. But every bedtime story, every bowl of stew, every lesson at the kitchen table, every quiet moment when they stayed instead of leaving, they were giving me a new story to grow into. One strong enough to survive the day my biological parents came back and tried to rip open old wounds for the sake of a fortune that had never belonged to them. Winning the case didn't erase the hurt. It didn't magically patch over the years I spent wondering why I wasn't enough for the two people who were supposed to love me without being asked. But it did something deeper. It reminded me of the people who did choose me, who fought for me, who believed in me long before I believed in myself. It reminded me that I came from love, not the loud, performative kind, but the quiet, unwavering kind built through 1,000 tiny choices. I think about my grandfather's final words often. Truth survives everything. At the time, they felt like a riddle I wasn't ready to solve. Now I know he wasn't just talking about the court case or the will. He was talking about the truth of who we become when life tries to break us. The truth of who raised us. The truth of what love really looks like. And most of all, the truth we choose to carry forward. I've presided over dozens of cases since I became a judge. Some days I sit behind the bench and see echoes of my younger self in the people who stand in front of me. Children caught between adults who confuse biology with entitlement, parents who mistake possession for love, families who use guilt as currency and affection as leverage. I try to meet each case with the same integrity my grandfather lived by, but also with the compassion my grandmother wove into every part of my childhood. I can't save everyone, but I can listen. I can see them. And sometimes that alone changes something. Even now, when I return to Aspen, I stop at the edge of the meadow where the lupine grows. The house feels smaller than I remember, quieter, but the memories fill every room like warm light. I see my grandmother kneading dough by the window. I hear my grandfather clearing his throat before reading me a section of the newspaper he thought I was ready to understand. I smell pine wood smoke, old books, fresh snow melting on the porch. The past doesn't hurt as sharply anymore. It settles around me like a reminder I was never alone. I was chosen. And maybe that's why I'm telling this story now. Not because I want sympathy, not because I want anyone to be angry on my behalf, but because someone out there might need to hear that they are more than the people who failed them, more than the people who walked away, more than the wounds they inherited. We don't always get to choose where we begin, but we always get to choose how the story continues. If you're still here with me, if you've listened all the way to this point, I want to thank you. Sharing something this personal is never easy, even for someone who stands in a courtroom for a living. But knowing someone is on the other side of the screen, someone listening, someone understanding, makes a difference. It reminds me that stories aren't meant to be carried alone. They're meant to be shared, so the weight becomes a little lighter for everyone who hears them. Before you go, I'd truly love to know you're here with me. If you're comfortable, drop a simple hi in the comments or tell me where you're listening from. Whether you're curled up in your living room, sitting in traffic, or winding down after a long day, I'd love to hear from you. Sometimes even the smallest connection reminds us that we aren't as alone as we feel. And if my story resonated with you in any way, if a piece of it reminded you of your own journey, or if it helped you breathe a little easier, tonight I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. It helps share these stories with people who might need them, people who might be living through something similar, people who could use a reminder that healing doesn't happen in silence. Thank you for staying with me, for listening, for giving my story a place to land. And wherever you are right now, whatever you're going through, I hope you remember this family is not defined by who creates us, but by who shows up for us, who stays and who loves us without needing a reason. That truth survives everything.